The story of Lucky Luciano is one of power, betrayal, and survival, a tale that transcends time and continues to captivate audiences with its raw complexity. Born in the streets of New York, a city teeming with ambition and chaos, Luciano rose from nothing to become the man who would shape the modern mafia. His life is not just a series of crimes, but a journey that delves into the very psychology of power, loyalty, and fear. In this introduction, we establish Luciano as the central figure of the narrative, a man who embodied both the contradictions and brutal realities of organized crime. From the beginning, Luciano was a character defined by his hunger for control. As a young boy in a poor immigrant family, his rise was almost inevitable, driven by an innate understanding of the streets and an unwavering belief in his ability to ascend above the chaos around him. But this was not simply a story of ambition, it was a story of survival in a world that constantly tested him. From the moment he entered the criminal underworld, his fate was sealed, and he knew it. What makes Luciano's story compelling is not only his rise to power but how he navigated the dark world of betrayal, loyalty, and shifting allegiances. His era was one of both opportunity and brutal violence. Prohibition, gambling, smuggling, and labor unions, all ripe for exploitation. But what set Luciano apart from his contemporaries was his ability to look beyond mere violence. He saw crime as a business, one that could be organized, managed, and expanded. In the cutthroat world of the mafia, where violence was often the final answer, Luciano brought strategy, vision, and intelligence. He was a thinker, a manipulator, a planner, not just a gangster. This documentary aims to explore the man behind the myth. While Luciano's rise to power is legendary, the complexity of his character is what makes him fascinating. Was he a ruthless criminal, or a man simply playing by the rules of a brutal world? As we journey through his life, we will see how Luciano reshaped organized crime, leaving a legacy that continues to influence the world of illegal enterprises to this day. The questions about his true nature, and his lasting impact, linger as we delve deeper into his story. As we move forward, the viewer will be guided through each stage of Luciano's life, from his early years as a streetwise youth in New York, to his strategic rise to power, and ultimately to the personal and professional betrayals that marked the final years of his life. But this isn't just a tale of criminality. It's a story of a man who, in many ways, was ahead of his time. A man who understood the complexities of human nature and the fine line between power and downfall. In examining Luciano's life, we will also reflect on how his actions shaped the mafia and the criminal world we know today. His legacy is not only defined by the vast empire he built but also by the psychological, emotional, and moral conflicts he faced. This documentary will aim to answer the question: who was Lucky Luciano really? A legend? A criminal mastermind? Or simply a man who played the cards he was dealt? Through his story, we'll also uncover the wider implications of his life, how his rise and fall symbolize the very nature of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the inevitable consequences of unchecked power. It is a story not just of one man, but of the world he helped create. Before Lucky Luciano transformed the mafia into a powerful, cohesive criminal empire, the underworld of America was a fragmented and chaotic realm. This was a time when criminal families operated in isolation, each one vying for control over different territories. The lack of unity within the mafia allowed for internal strife, endless power struggles, and constant violence. The mafia as we know it today didn't exist yet. It was a world full of competing factions, each led by powerful figures, but without the strategic cooperation that would later define Luciano's reign. The era before Luciano was one of fragmentation, a time when the mafia was less organized and more like a loose collection of competing families. In the early 1900s, the Italian-American mafia was divided between two major factions, the Sicilian and the Neapolitan factions. The Sicilians, led by figures such as Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, were dominant in New York, while the Neapolitans operated their own networks, often in smaller, more discreet ways. The fierce rivalry between these factions created an environment rife with instability. Each faction tried to expand its territory, engaging in bloody wars to control the lucrative opportunities that Prohibition had opened up. Prohibition, which began in 1920, would go on to reshape organized crime in America. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited the production, sale, and distribution of alcoholic beverages, created a black market that was eagerly seized upon by criminal organizations. With alcohol banned, bootlegging became a highly profitable enterprise, and the mafia saw an opportunity for tremendous financial gain. However, instead of creating a unified front, this newfound wealth fueled competition and violence between rival factions. Every mobster was vying for a piece of the pie, and in the absence of a clear leader, it often resulted in bloodshed. The criminal world in the early 20th century was also influenced by powerful external forces. The American government during this time was becoming more aggressive in its crackdown on organized crime. Law enforcement efforts, while often ineffective, put pressure on the mafia to adapt and find more subtle ways to operate. The authorities' attempts to break up the mafia often only intensified the animosity between rival families. Moreover, the rapid expansion of the mafia during this time wasn't just limited to New York. Crime families began to spread to other major cities like Chicago, New Orleans, and Detroit. Despite the chaos, one thing was certain: the mafia was a powerful force, but it lacked the structure and unity that would later define Luciano's vision. The underworld was defined by raw power, with each gang leader seeking to carve out their own domain. This was a world ruled by blood feuds, where power struggles were resolved through brutal force and cunning. The old-school methods of leadership, relying on strength, intimidation, and the ability to outwit enemies, were dominant. It was in this volatile environment that Lucky Luciano was able to rise to prominence. Luciano didn't just see the world of organized crime as an arena for power struggles. He saw it as an opportunity for rational organization. He recognized the potential of the mafia, but understood that it needed to be consolidated into a cohesive unit to operate more effectively and profitably. In a world full of chaos, he would become the man who brought order to the madness. The historical context of this period is crucial to understanding Luciano's subsequent rise. His ability to take advantage of the instability in the underworld, and to form alliances where others saw only competition, was a game-changer. Luciano didn't just want to control a territory, he wanted to reshape the entire structure of organized crime. To do this, he needed to navigate the fractured world of the mafia, a world full of egos, alliances, and betrayals, and make the connections that would allow him to rise above it all. The moment Luciano began to see the bigger picture, that the key to domination was unity, is when his rise started to seem inevitable. In a world defined by fragmented power, Luciano was preparing to bring about a seismic shift. But before he could create the network that would define the modern mafia, he needed to outwit his rivals, forge crucial alliances, and most importantly, navigate the ongoing power struggle between the Sicilian and Neapolitan factions. The world before Luciano was one of constant war and disunity, but it was also a world full of opportunity for someone like him. Someone with the vision and ruthlessness to unite the fractured families and build an empire. As we move forward in this documentary, we will explore how Luciano's unique approach to leadership would not only end the chaos of the past but also lay the foundation for the modern criminal empire we recognize today. This section sets the stage for understanding the world Luciano was born into and gives the viewer a clear picture of the instability, violence, and competition that defined his early years in the criminal underworld. Luciano's story begins on the gritty streets of New York City, where ambition and survival were the only currencies that mattered. Born Salvatore Lucania on November 24, 1897, in the slums of the Lower East Side, his early life was one of poverty, hardship, and constant struggle. His immigrant parents, who had fled the poverty-stricken region of Sicily, had hoped for a better life in America, but the reality was far from the American dream. Instead, young Salvatore grew up surrounded by crime, corruption, and social unrest, all of which left a permanent mark on him. It was in this environment, harsh, unforgiving, and violent, that Luciano's ambition began to take root. From an early age, Luciano showed a keen awareness of his environment. Unlike many of his peers who were simply trying to survive, Salvatore had a certain drive, a hunger that set him apart. The streets were full of opportunity, but only for those who were willing to take it by force. The Lower East Side was a melting pot of ethnicities, a place where the mafia's influence already held sway. There were gang wars, petty criminals, and hardened men who lived by a code of survival. For Luciano, this was the crucible in which he would forge his destiny. His early years were marked by brushes with the law, petty thefts, and occasional skirmishes with rival gang members. He wasn't born a criminal mastermind, rather he was a product of his environment, shaped by the brutal world around him. As a teenager, he found himself increasingly drawn to the criminal world. While his peers were simply looking for ways to make ends meet, Luciano was looking for power, a way to rise above the limits of his circumstances. It wasn't long before he was recruited by local gangsters who recognized his sharp mind, his cool-headed nature, and his willingness to do whatever it took to survive. His first significant taste of the underworld came when he joined the notorious 5 Points Gang, a powerful criminal organization that controlled much of the Lower East Side. The gang was involved in various illicit activities, from bootlegging to extortion to gambling. It was here, under the mentorship of influential gang leaders like the infamous Johnny Torrio, that Luciano learned the ropes of organized crime. More than just a street thug, Luciano quickly demonstrated his potential as a strategist. He was not content with petty street-level crimes, he saw the bigger picture. He understood that in the criminal world, survival depended on more than just brute force. It required alliances, strategy, and an unwavering focus on the endgame. Luciano's ability to think ahead and calculate his moves would set him apart from the other criminals around him. He quickly became known not just for his ruthlessness, but also for his ability to organize, strategize, and build relationships with other factions. He recognized that while street-level crime could offer short-term rewards, it was not the key to long-term power. Luciano began to build a network of alliances with other crime families, forging connections with key figures like Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. These relationships would prove crucial as his influence grew and he began to climb the ranks of the mafia. But Luciano was also keenly aware of the dangers of being a small-time player in the larger world of organized crime. He knew that in order to rise to the top, he would have to eliminate the competition, sometimes through cunning, sometimes through violence. In the world of the mafia, trust was a rare commodity, and betrayal was a constant threat. But Luciano thrived in this environment. His calculating nature allowed him to outmaneuver his rivals, and his ability to manipulate people made him a force to be reckoned with. By the time Luciano was in his early 20s, he had already begun to make a name for himself in the criminal underworld. But it was during the Prohibition era that his rise to power would truly accelerate. Prohibition, which began in 1920, prohibited the sale of alcohol in the United States, creating a massive black market for bootlegging and alcohol distribution. The mafia, ever quick to recognize a lucrative opportunity, capitalized on this by smuggling alcohol into the country, controlling illegal bars and running speakeasies. Luciano saw the potential of prohibition in ways that others did not. While many mafia bosses focused solely on making money, Luciano realized that the Prohibition era provided the perfect opportunity to consolidate power and expand his influence. Rather than operating as a small-time gangster, Luciano was already thinking on a larger scale. He began to form alliances with other crime families and established a network of trusted men who helped him smuggle alcohol, run operations, and oversee his growing empire. By the mid-1920s, Luciano had proven himself not only as a brutal enforcer but also as a brilliant strategist who understood the business side of crime. During this time, Luciano also became increasingly involved in the growing conflict between two powerful mafia bosses, Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. These two men, both Sicilian, represented the old-school way of running the mafia. They were ruthless, power-hungry, and obsessed with maintaining their dominance over the underworld. But Luciano, though still technically loyal to Masuria, saw the writing on the wall. He recognized that the old ways were holding the mafia back and that change was necessary for the organization to evolve. The war between Masuria and Maranzano, known as the Castellammarese War, would become the backdrop for Luciano's rise to power. In the midst of this bloody conflict, Luciano began to make his move. He cleverly manipulated both sides, using his connections and his ability to make alliances to his advantage. In 1931, Luciano made the ultimate move. He orchestrated the murder of Joe Masuria, signaling his break from the old guard. The assassination of Masuria was a turning point not just for Luciano but for the mafia as a whole. It was the moment that solidified his position as a rising star in the criminal world. Luciano's rise from street kid to mafia boss was not just a story of ambition. It was a story of adaptability, intelligence, and timing. His ability to read people, understand the intricacies of power dynamics, and seize opportunities when they arose allowed him to rise above the chaos of the criminal underworld. But more than anything, it was his vision, his understanding that organized crime needed to evolve into something more structured, more businesslike, that set him apart from his contemporaries. Luciano's ambition was not just about power for its own sake. It was about control, influence, and the ability to shape the future of the mafia. By the time he orchestrated Masuria's death, Luciano had already begun to lay the groundwork for a new era of organized crime, an era that would see the mafia transformed from a disjointed group of street gangs into a sophisticated, organized network of criminal enterprises. His rise from street kid to mafia boss was just the beginning of his transformation into one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime. Luciano's rise to power wasn't simply a matter of rising through the ranks of the mafia. It was the beginning of a radical transformation within the world of organized crime. At the heart of Luciano's genius was his understanding of criminal enterprises not as chaotic factions, but as a business that could be structured, expanded, and maximized for profit. He didn't just want to rule a neighborhood or a city, he envisioned building an empire. A modern, efficient criminal network that operated like a corporation, with every faction playing a specific role in a well-oiled machine. This section explores how Lucky Luciano began to build and organize the mafia in a way that would forever change its operations. After the bloody conflict of the Castellamarese War and the demise of Joe Masuria in 1931, Luciano found himself in control of a unified New York mafia. But while many would have been content with the spoils of war, the control of territory, power, and wealth, Luciano saw the potential for much more. He was not just concerned with domination, he was concerned with creating an organization that would last. The traditional, fragmented mafia factions that ruled New York were rooted in old-school ideas: personal loyalty, family feuds, and brute force. Luciano recognized that these methods had limits. If the mafia was to grow and prosper in the modern world, it needed to evolve. The first step in Luciano's transformation of the mafia was the creation of the Commission, a governing body that would oversee all mafia families and act as a central authority. The Commission was a revolutionary idea. It was designed to prevent unnecessary violence and reduce the inter-family conflicts that had plagued the mafia for decades. By centralizing decision-making, the Commission allowed Luciano to control the direction of the mafia as a whole, while still maintaining the autonomy of individual families. This centralized structure helped maintain peace within the mafia, enabling it to expand its reach without being bogged down by constant infighting. But the Commission wasn't just about control, it was also about consolidation. Luciano recognized that for the mafia to thrive, it needed to have a unified front. The days of feuding Sicilian factions were over. Luciano used his influence to unite not just the Sicilian families but also the Neapolitan and Jewish factions that were scattered throughout New York. Through a series of well-calculated alliances, Luciano was able to build a network that spanned the city, connecting rival families and making them work together for mutual profit. In doing so, he created an empire that was stronger and more resilient than any individual family had been. As Luciano expanded his power, he began to think about how the mafia could operate more efficiently. In the past, each family operated independently, often competing for the same illicit activities. But Luciano saw an opportunity to streamline the operations and create a more effective system. He began to implement organizational strategies that would make the mafia operate like a legitimate business. Each family would have its own area of expertise, whether it was bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, or labor racketeering. But rather than working in isolation, each family would be expected to share profits and work together to eliminate competition. A key to Luciano's success was his ability to manage people. While many of his contemporaries focused on the brute force needed to maintain power, Luciano understood that loyalty and trust were just as important as violence. He was a master of manipulation, using psychological tactics to bend people to his will. He understood that the mafia was not just about fear, it was about loyalty, and loyalty could be bought, built, and maintained through careful management. One of the most important aspects of Luciano's empire building was his ability to operate across various industries. While many of his fellow mobsters were focused solely on traditional rackets like gambling and bootlegging, Luciano realized that the real money lay in controlling labor unions and infiltrating legitimate businesses. Luciano was no longer just a mob boss, he was a businessman. He expanded his operations into the docks, the trucking industry, and construction, and even influenced political elections by supporting corrupt politicians who would help protect his interests. Through his influence over labor unions, Luciano was able to control entire industries, making him an invaluable figure in both the criminal and legitimate business worlds. In fact, Luciano's ability to control the labor unions gave him an unprecedented level of power. He was able to effectively shut down entire industries, use strikes as leverage, and control the flow of goods and services. This made him a formidable force, not just within the criminal underworld, but also within the broader political and economic landscape of the United States. Additionally, Luciano had a remarkable ability to manage his relationships with his key associates. Meyer Lansky, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, and Frank Costello were some of the men who helped Luciano grow his empire. These men were more than just loyal soldiers, they were partners in crime, each bringing his own set of skills to the table. Lansky, for example, was a master of finance and helped Luciano launder money, while Siegel was involved in the development of illicit gambling operations in places like Las Vegas. Luciano's ability to assemble a team of highly skilled, highly trusted men allowed him to focus on expanding the empire while they took care of the day-to-day operations. Luciano's strategic mind was not limited to just his alliances within the U.S. His reach extended across the world. His connections in Italy, Cuba, and even South America helped expand his empire beyond the confines of New York City. Luciano knew that to maintain power he needed to operate on a global scale. As Prohibition ended in the United States, Luciano adapted to the new landscape by diversifying his criminal activities. Instead of relying solely on the illegal alcohol trade, he expanded into drugs, extortion, and even international smuggling rings. His ability to adapt to changing circumstances and find new avenues for profit ensured that his empire remained profitable, even as the world around him shifted. A crucial element in Luciano's ability to build and sustain his empire was his understanding of fear and loyalty. While some mafia bosses ruled through sheer intimidation, Luciano was more nuanced in his approach. He understood that fear could only go so far. Loyalty had to be earned, not just forced. His charismatic leadership style, combined with his strategic genius, allowed him to cultivate a loyal following of men who were willing to go to great lengths for him. His ability to inspire both fear and loyalty made him the perfect leader to guide the mafia into a new era. By the late 1930s, Luciano had achieved his ultimate goal. He had transformed the mafia from a disjointed, bickering collection of families into a highly organized and profitable criminal empire. Under his leadership, the mafia began to function like a well-oiled machine. Every decision, every action, every alliance was calculated to ensure the survival and growth of the organization. Luciano had become the undisputed king of the underworld, and his influence stretched from the streets of New York to the highest levels of American politics and business. In building his empire, Luciano not only consolidated power within the mafia but also shaped the way organized crime would operate for generations to come. His ability to unite disparate factions, his vision for a more efficient criminal organization, and his emphasis on loyalty, strategy, and financial control were key to his success. By turning crime into a business, he laid the foundation for the modern mafia, setting the stage for the criminal empires that would follow in his wake. In the end, Luciano's ability to organize, expand, and adapt ensured that his empire would endure, even long after his fall from grace. In the underworld Luciano inhabited, loyalty and silence were not just valued, they were paramount. At the heart of this loyalty was a code, the omerta, which defined the moral and psychological fabric of mafia life. The term omerta refers to a set of unwritten rules that govern mafia members' behavior, requiring them to maintain complete silence about the organization's operations and to uphold a strict loyalty to the group. This unspoken contract demanded not only silence in the face of law enforcement but also a profound moral loyalty to one's family, even if it meant sacrificing personal relationships or values. The Code of Omerta was built on the understanding that betrayal was the greatest sin within the mafia world. To break the code meant not only facing death but also dishonoring one's family and the mafia as a whole. This moral framework governed every aspect of life within the organization, from the smallest street-level operator to the most powerful bosses. Loyalty was the foundation upon which the entire structure of the mafia rested, and breaking that loyalty could lead to devastating consequences. For Luciano, omerta wasn't just a rule, it was a tool of control. His ability to enforce this code within his ranks gave him leverage over his men and kept his empire functioning like a well-oiled machine. In Luciano's mafia, silence was not only about avoiding the law but also about keeping secrets from rivals, family members, and even close allies. This atmosphere of secrecy created an environment where trust, though often hard-earned, was invaluable. As long as the men under Luciano's command adhered to the code of silence, he could rest assured that the inner workings of his empire would remain hidden from both the public eye and law enforcement. But omerta wasn't just about maintaining the mafia's secrecy, it was also about maintaining order. Within Luciano's empire, the code enforced a hierarchy of power, where loyalty to the boss was paramount. The code dictated how lower-ranking members interacted with their superiors and how each member of the mafia contributed to the larger system. As long as they kept their mouths shut, followed orders, and worked together, they could benefit from the protection, wealth, and power the mafia offered. This provided an unspoken social contract. Those who adhered to omerta were rewarded with status, protection, and the potential for wealth. In addition to loyalty, omerta also placed a high value on the psychological power of fear. The consequences of breaking the code were severe, often involving violent retribution. This punishment, usually death, was not only a means of enforcing silence but also served as a psychological tool to instill fear within the ranks. The mafia understood that fear could be used as a motivator, not just for the lower-ranking soldiers who needed to comply with the boss's orders, but also for potential traitors. The threat of violent retribution ensured that no one would dare to break their silence. The psychological aspect of omerta also extended to the way members of the mafia viewed their world. The underworld, governed by omerta, was a separate reality from the mainstream society, one where traditional morality did not apply. For Luciano and his followers, the world of the mafia provided a sense of purpose, a place where loyalty, power, and respect were the ultimate currency. This alternative moral universe allowed Luciano to operate without the constraints that bound regular society. It allowed him to recruit, control, and keep his empire intact, all while remaining detached from conventional laws and rules. Yet, despite the strictness of omerta, the code was not always foolproof. Like all systems of control, it was subject to human frailties. As time went on, the pressures of maintaining such a strict code began to weigh heavily on some members. The mafia wasn't just a network of criminals. It was also a group of individuals with their own ambitions, desires, and personal conflicts. This made omerta increasingly difficult to uphold, especially when loyalty was tested by personal betrayal, greed, or fear. The fear of punishment, while effective, was not always enough to prevent members from seeking personal advantage or breaking the code. Luciano's own leadership style reflected the tension between maintaining loyalty through fear and building a sense of respect. While omerta was crucial to keeping his men in line, Luciano also understood that blind loyalty could be dangerous if it wasn't tempered by a sense of respect for the structure he had created. He didn't just want followers, he wanted men who believed in the mafia's mission, even if it meant that some would inevitably betray the organization. This conflict, between loyalty and betrayal, silence and personal ambition, became a defining feature of Luciano's reign. For him, omerta was not just a means of keeping his empire intact. It was a constant balancing act between enforcing strict loyalty and maintaining the respect and trust of his allies. In the world of organized crime, where betrayal was often lurking just around the corner, Luciano's ability to manage both sides of the equation was what made him not just a powerful boss but a master tactician. Ultimately, omerta was more than just a rule, it was the moral and psychological glue that held the mafia together. Without it, the entire system would collapse into chaos. Yet, even as it provided stability, it also created a culture of paranoia and fear, where no one could be entirely trusted and where every move could be watched. Luciano's success lay not only in his ability to enforce this code but also in his understanding of its deeper psychological effects. He knew that the fear of betrayal was as powerful as the loyalty it demanded, and this allowed him to build and maintain an empire that would endure long after his downfall. Lucky Luciano's vision for organized crime was revolutionary. He didn't just see the mafia as a chaotic group of thugs. He viewed it as an empire to be built, managed, and expanded. His genius lay in transforming criminal activities into highly efficient, structured businesses. While others in the underworld relied on brute force and crude tactics, Luciano understood that success depended on organization, diversification, and, most importantly, profit maximization. By treating crime as a business, he ensured the mafia's growth and made it a lasting power in the world of organized crime. One of Luciano's most significant innovations was the creation of a centralized structure that unified the various mafia families under the commission. This allowed him to consolidate power and reduce infighting, creating a more effective and profitable operation. Luciano saw the mafia not as isolated groups of criminals, but as interconnected businesses that could thrive under coordinated leadership. The commission provided oversight and helped resolve conflicts, ensuring that each family worked together for mutual benefit rather than competing against each other. During Prohibition, Luciano capitalized on the immense profits generated by the illegal alcohol trade. He organized the distribution of alcohol across the United States, setting up an extensive network that stretched from New York to Chicago, controlling everything from production to distribution. But Luciano's vision extended beyond bootlegging. As the alcohol trade waned with the repeal of Prohibition in 1933, he diversified his operations, expanding into gambling, extortion, and union racketeering. His control over labor unions, especially in industries like construction and shipping, provided a steady flow of income and leverage over legitimate businesses. Luciano also expanded his operations globally. His influence spread to Cuba, where he helped develop the illegal gambling industry, and even into Italy and South America, where smuggling operations thrived. This international network allowed Luciano to operate beyond the reach of American law enforcement, creating a global criminal syndicate that could profit from multiple illicit activities, including drugs and arms trafficking. By managing crime like a corporation, Luciano transformed the mafia into a global enterprise, ensuring it would endure long after his reign. His business acumen not only made him one of the wealthiest and most powerful figures in organized crime but also laid the foundation for modern criminal enterprises. His ability to turn crime into a business made him a visionary, shaping the future of the mafia and its operations. Lucky Luciano's ascent to power was shaped by his strategic alliances and constant management of rivals and enemies. Unlike many mafia bosses who relied on brute force, Luciano understood the value of relationships. His rise was not just a battle of violence, it was also a battle of manipulation, loyalty, and diplomacy. One of his most important alliances was with Meyer Lansky, a Jewish gangster who became a trusted financial partner. Lansky's expertise in money laundering helped Luciano turn his criminal operations into a well-oiled machine. Together, they ensured the mafia's survival and prosperity, even as legal and law enforcement pressures mounted. Lansky's ability to handle finances and control illicit profits helped Luciano grow beyond street-level rackets into legitimate-sounding businesses, making his empire even more powerful and less detectable. Additionally, Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, another key ally, worked with Luciano to expand the mafia's reach into the world of gambling. Siegel's involvement in the development of the first major mafia-backed casino in Las Vegas marked a turning point for Luciano. This partnership helped Luciano diversify his criminal operations, turning gambling into one of the most profitable areas of his empire. But while Luciano built alliances, he also faced formidable enemies. The most notable were Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, who controlled the rival mafia factions in New York. These bosses stood in the way of Luciano's vision for a unified mafia. Luciano's cunning led to the demise of both Masuria and Maranzano, removing the old-school Sicilian leadership and consolidating power under his rule. The violent power struggle led to the creation of the Commission, a system that would govern the mafia's operations more efficiently. Despite his victories, Luciano's rule was never free of internal strife. Vito Genovese, once a trusted ally, eventually turned on Luciano, seeking his position. Their conflict culminated in an assassination attempt on Luciano. Though Genovese failed, it marked the dangers of betrayal within the mafia. Similarly, Luciano's relationship with Frank Costello soured over time as Costello's ambition grew. In the world of organized crime, Luciano constantly had to balance loyalty and betrayal. His ability to navigate these treacherous waters was key to his lasting influence, but it also made his reign precarious. In the world of organized crime, many of the most critical battles are fought not with guns or knives, but in the shadows. For Lucky Luciano, the hidden war was not only about surviving attacks from rivals but also about navigating the internal conflicts of the mafia and the constant pressure from law enforcement. This unseen battle was a test of his strategic brilliance and ability to manipulate both allies and enemies in ways that kept his empire intact. While Luciano's rise to power was marked by overt violence, such as the killings of Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, there was a subtler, but no less dangerous, battle occurring behind the scenes. The true strength of Luciano lay in his ability to manage these internal conflicts and external pressures, understanding that his survival wasn't just about eliminating rivals but also about knowing when to collaborate, when to fight, and how to maintain control over a vast criminal network. Internal conflicts and power struggles. Luciano's victory over Masuria and Maranzano, the two mafia giants in New York, seemed to pave the way for his dominance. However, the power vacuum left by their deaths triggered new rivalries, and the mafia was still fraught with tension. Luciano's main concern was maintaining a balance between the different factions in his criminal empire. His most prominent struggle came from within his own ranks. His former ally Vito Genovese grew increasingly ambitious. Genovese, who had helped orchestrate the deaths of Masuria and Maranzano, began to see himself as the rightful leader of the mafia. After Luciano's conviction and subsequent exile, Genovese made a move to take control of the mafia. However, Luciano's loyalists were quick to quash Genovese's power grab, though this internal betrayal left Luciano with scars that would take years to heal. The war against law enforcement. While internal power struggles were a constant threat, Luciano also had to deal with the persistent presence of law enforcement. The rise of federal agencies like the FBI, as well as the growing focus on organized crime, meant that Luciano's every move was under scrutiny. His ability to operate without being caught became a defining feature of his rule. Luciano's approach to avoiding the law was methodical. He built relationships with corrupt officials, used intermediaries to maintain distance from his operations, and made his criminal empire as discreet as possible. Yet, despite these precautions, Luciano's empire was always vulnerable. In 1936, Luciano was arrested on charges of running a prostitution ring, and in 1937 he was convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. This setback was significant, but Luciano's empire didn't crumble. His ability to continue controlling operations from behind bars demonstrated his resilience and ability to wage war from the shadows. Exile and the ongoing battle. Luciano's conviction was not the end of his influence. In 1946, the U.S. government, eager to remove him as a threat, deported Luciano to Italy. While this move appeared to sever his ties to the American mafia, Luciano continued to exert influence from abroad. His global connections and ongoing dealings in places like Cuba and Italy allowed him to maintain control over the mafia's activities. His exile proved that the hidden war was not just a battle against law enforcement or internal rivals, it was a constant fight for survival, even when physically removed from the action. Luciano's influence stretched far beyond the United States, and his ability to broker deals and control operations from Italy is a testament to his power. He became a key figure in the international underworld, negotiating with other criminal syndicates, establishing new smuggling routes, and ensuring the mafia's global reach. Even in exile, Luciano's survival instinct never waned, and his legacy continued to shape the criminal landscape. Conclusion: the hidden war's legacy. Luciano's ability to survive in the face of this hidden war, both internally within his organization and externally against law enforcement, solidified his position as one of the most formidable figures in mafia history. His skill in navigating these complex and covert battles, along with his unyielding ability to maintain power through manipulation, strategic alliances, and sheer determination, ensured that his empire endured. While the public battles of the mafia, the gang wars and killings, are the ones most remembered, it was the hidden war fought in the shadows and through strategy that truly defined Luciano's reign. His ability to outmaneuver rivals, evade the law, and maintain control even in exile ensured that his legacy lived on long after his imprisonment. The hidden war that Luciano waged is a testament to his genius as a criminal mastermind and his unmatched resilience in the face of insurmountable odds. Every empire, no matter how mighty, faces a moment when the balance of power shifts. For lucky Luciano, that moment came in the 1930s when the wheels of justice, which had so often failed to catch up with him, finally began to turn. Luciano's fall was not the result of a singular event but rather the culmination of the relentless pressures that come with wielding absolute power in a world built on violence, deceit, and betrayal. Despite his genius in organizing and consolidating the mafia, Luciano's empire could not shield him from the forces of law enforcement, internal discontent, and external pressures that would eventually lead to his downfall. The long arm of the law. Luciano had always been adept at eluding the law. His operations were organized with such precision and foresight that it often seemed as though the authorities were several steps behind. He kept his hands clean, delegating the dirty work to underlings while he orchestrated the vast network of criminal enterprises from the shadows. His alliances with corrupt politicians, judges, and law enforcement officials further insulated him from legal consequences. But even the most carefully constructed empire has its cracks, and eventually, the long arm of the law would find its way to him. In 1936, Luciano's criminal operations were targeted by the government, which had been building a case against him for years. The authorities zeroed in on one of his most profitable activities, the running of prostitution rings. The case against him was airtight, built on wiretaps, testimonies from disgruntled underlings, and relentless pressure from federal agents. In a moment that would change the course of his life, Luciano was arrested and charged with compulsory prostitution, an offense that would see him convicted and sentenced to a lengthy prison term. The trial was a media circus, with journalists descending upon New York to cover the sensational story of the mafia boss brought to justice. For the first time, Luciano, who had spent his entire career operating in the shadows, found himself publicly exposed. The publicity surrounding the case was unavoidable, and despite his previous successes in evading law enforcement, Luciano was caught in the full force of the American justice system. Betrayal from within. As if facing the authorities wasn't enough, Luciano also had to contend with the simmering discontent brewing within his own ranks. Though he had built his empire on strategic alliances and mutual benefit, those alliances were always fragile. The higher a man rises in the criminal underworld, the more enemies he accumulates, and the more likely it becomes that betrayal will come from within. In the case of Luciano, this betrayal came from Vito Genovese, once one of his most trusted allies. Genovese had been instrumental in the deaths of Masuria and Maranzano, helping Luciano secure his position at the top of the mafia hierarchy. However, as Luciano's empire grew, so did Genovese's ambition. Feeling overlooked and sidelined, Genovese made several attempts to wrest control of the mafia from Luciano. It is said that he even made a move to have Luciano killed, though this attempt was foiled. Ultimately, Luciano's time in prison left him vulnerable, and Genovese seized the opportunity to solidify his own power. Although Genovese's coup was short-lived, it served as a stark reminder of the dangers of trusting too many people, especially in the treacherous world of organized crime. The mafia's internal dynamics had shifted, and the loyalty that had once been cemented by shared victories was beginning to fracture under the strain of personal ambitions. The system finally catches up despite his extensive network of corruption. Luciano's downfall was inevitable. Once convicted, his fate was sealed. The law enforcement authorities had spent years building a case against him, and in 1937 he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison for his involvement in running prostitution rings. But even in prison, Luciano's fate was not completely in the hands of the authorities. He would not go quietly. In prison, Luciano remained a powerful figure. His influence within the mafia and his ongoing connections with his allies on the outside allowed him to continue running his operations, albeit from behind bars. Luciano had always been a master of organization, and this included his ability to delegate authority to his trusted men. His role as a figurehead remained important even while imprisoned. He continued to communicate with his associates, ensuring that the mafia's criminal enterprises continued to operate smoothly despite his incarceration. But the fall of Luciano, as powerful as he remained from prison, marked the beginning of a shift in the underworld. His arrest and conviction represented a victory for law enforcement, but it also signified the unraveling of the very system he had created. His fall was symbolic of the pressures that even the most successful crime bosses face when their empires grow too large. The law could only stay out of the way for so long, and betrayal from those closest to him highlighted the inherent instability within any criminal organization. Reflection on the fall. Luciano's fall was not just the result of external forces, but also the inevitable consequence of the dangerous game he had played for so long. His empire had grown too large, too powerful, and too complicated to maintain without cracks appearing in the foundation. The internal struggles, personal betrayals, and relentless pressure from the government all converged in a moment of reckoning that could not be avoided. In many ways, the fall of Lucky Luciano was a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the price of power. The very qualities that had helped him build his empire, his intelligence, his ruthlessness, and his ability to form strategic alliances, were also the ones that ultimately led to his downfall. While Luciano's influence continued to resonate in the world of organized crime long after his conviction, the end of his reign was a reminder that no one, not even the most powerful crime boss in history, is immune to the forces that drive the world of crime. Luciano's downfall marked the end of an era in the mafia. The era of the classic mafia boss, a figure who built an empire through personal connections and the ruthless pursuit of power, was over. In the years that followed, new leaders would emerge, but the landscape of organized crime would never be the same. Luciano's fall was inevitable, but it was also the beginning of a new chapter in the history of the mafia, one that would be shaped by the lessons learned from his rise and his eventual collapse. The trial of Lucky Luciano was not just a legal proceeding. It was a media spectacle that captivated the nation and marked a critical turning point in the history of organized crime. For a man who had spent his entire career in the shadows, orchestrating his empire from behind the scenes, being thrust into the public eye was both a personal and professional crisis. The trial was an embodiment of the growing tension between the mafia's covert operations and the increasing power of law enforcement. For Luciano, this was no longer just about protecting his empire, it was about survival. The case against Luciano. By the time Luciano was arrested in 1936, the authorities had spent years building an extensive case against him. The charges against him were not based on a single crime but on a pattern of illegal activities that spanned decades. At the heart of the prosecution's case was Luciano's involvement in running a massive prostitution ring. The government, having successfully infiltrated some of Luciano's operations, had gathered compelling evidence of his involvement in forced prostitution, racketeering, and other illicit activities. Wiretaps, testimonies from former associates, and surveillance had pieced together a picture of Luciano as the mastermind behind a vast and highly organized criminal network. For the first time, Luciano's operations were laid bare for the public. His criminal empire was not just about street-level violence or petty theft but about an elaborate, systematized structure that reached into multiple industries, from gambling and narcotics to labor unions and the protection rackets. What made the case particularly damning was the involvement of several high-ranking members of society, including corrupt politicians and law enforcement officials, who were implicated in the network of corruption surrounding Luciano. The prosecution's strategy was to present him as the central figure in a web of criminality that reached the highest echelons of power, and it worked. But Luciano was no ordinary defendant. He had spent years cultivating relationships with influential people in various sectors, and even behind bars he maintained access to key allies who could exert pressure on the trial. However, as the proceedings began, it became clear that the prosecution had a solid case, and the courtroom drama intensified. This was no longer a simple trial. It had become a symbol of the government's commitment to cracking down on organized crime and a direct challenge to the mafia's power. The media frenzy Luciano's trial quickly became a national event, a media circus that captured the imagination of the public. In an era when the mafia was often seen as an almost mythical force, the public's fascination with Luciano was undeniable. Newspapers eagerly covered every detail of the trial, with headlines proclaiming the downfall of the notorious king of the underworld. The trial was a rare moment of transparency in a world that had long operated in the shadows. For many, it was their first real look into the inner workings of the mafia and the intricate web of crime and corruption that Luciano had built. Luciano, who had always been able to operate with a sense of anonymity, now found himself under the full glare of the media. For someone who thrived on secrecy, this was a humbling experience. His every move, every gesture was scrutinized, and for the first time his carefully constructed persona was being torn apart by public opinion. The once invincible Don now faced the kind of scrutiny that few criminals ever experience. Yet even in this challenging moment, Luciano remained composed. He was a man who had built his empire on control, and he wasn't about to lose that control in the courtroom. The sentencing in 1937, after a trial that lasted several months, Luciano was found guilty on charges of compulsory prostitution and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. The sentence was a harsh one, and it marked the beginning of a new chapter in Luciano's life, one that would be defined by his struggle to maintain power from behind bars. The sentence was a victory for law enforcement, but it was not the end of Luciano's story. Even while serving his sentence, Luciano's influence remained formidable. He continued to run his criminal empire, albeit through intermediaries, and his connections with key figures in the mafia allowed him to keep his grip on power, even from within the prison walls. The sentencing was not just a legal defeat, it was a personal blow to Luciano. His rise had been marked by an unwavering belief in his own invincibility. He had outsmarted the police, avoided numerous assassination attempts, and built an empire that spanned the globe. But now for the first time he was facing the full force of the law, and it threatened to destroy everything he had worked for. The verdict was a reminder that, in the world of organized crime, no one is untouchable, not even the most powerful figure in the mafia. A turning point in mafia history. Luciano's conviction marked a critical turning point not just in his life but in the history of the mafia. His trial and subsequent sentencing sent a powerful message to the criminal underworld. The law was closing in. For years, the mafia had operated with a sense of invulnerability, but the conviction of Luciano proved that even the most influential figures could be brought down. In many ways, it marked the beginning of the end of the old mafia, the era of the larger-than-life crime bosses like Luciano, who operated with a sense of impunity. But even in the face of this setback, Luciano's legacy was far from over. His trial and conviction may have weakened his immediate control, but they did not break him. From behind bars, he would continue to influence the world of organized crime, using his connections and strategic mind to maintain power. The trial and sentence represented a moment of vulnerability for Luciano, but they also cemented his place in history. Despite the conviction, he remained one of the most revered and feared figures in the criminal world. In the end, the trial and sentencing of Lucky Luciano highlighted the changing nature of the mafia, the growing influence of law enforcement, and the personal costs of power. While Luciano may have lost the battle in the courtroom, he was far from defeated. His ability to survive in the face of legal adversity and to continue shaping the future of organized crime would ensure that his story would be remembered for generations to come. The trial was not just a legal event, it was a pivotal moment in the life of one of the most legendary figures in the history of organized crime. Luciano's fall from the heights of power was swift and dramatic, but his ability to remain a powerful force in the underworld, even from prison, is a testament to his genius as a strategist and his unyielding resilience. While his sentencing to 30 to 50 years in prison in 1937 seemed like the final chapter of his story, it was far from it. Luciano's empire didn't simply collapse when he was locked away. Instead, it adapted and he maintained an iron grip over it, managing his criminal operations from behind bars. The story of Luciano's power behind bars is a story of survival, manipulation, and a continuing display of his uncanny ability to remain at the center of his empire despite his physical imprisonment. The power structure in prison. Upon entering prison, Luciano was placed in the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York, but it didn't take long for him to reassert control. His connections within the criminal world remained strong, and even though he was incarcerated, Luciano's network of allies and loyalists continued to act on his behalf. Prison, instead of being a place where his influence would wane, became an extension of the same empire he had built before his conviction. Luciano was a master of maintaining control, and this didn't change once he was behind bars. He quickly established a system of communication and coordination with the outside world through intermediaries. His most trusted lieutenants, including men like Frank Costello, continued to run day-to-day operations on the outside, but all key decisions and strategic moves still had to pass through Luciano. From prison he was still able to maintain his authority, thanks to his ability to direct his subordinates without ever physically leaving the walls of the facility. Luciano had always been a master of delegating power to others, and this ability did not diminish during his incarceration. His allies, including Meyer Lansky, who handled the financial aspects of the mafia, and Frank Costello, who was the de facto leader of Luciano's faction, kept his vision alive and ensured that the mafia continued to thrive in his absence. His loyalists in the prison system itself also helped to preserve his status. These connections, both within the mafia and among those who worked in the correction system, ensured that Luciano wasn't just surviving in prison, he was thriving. The role of intermediaries in mafia operations. One of the most striking aspects of Luciano's power behind bars was his ability to continue managing the vast network of illegal enterprises that he had established. Gambling operations, labor racketeering, bootlegging, and drug smuggling were all ongoing activities, and Luciano's involvement in them remained deep, even from his prison cell. While he no longer had the direct, physical control over his operations, he was still the mastermind pulling the strings. Luciano's most important intermediary was Frank Costello, a man who had been a crucial ally for Luciano for many years. Costello took on the role of running day-to-day operations, managing both the political connections and the street-level activities. He acted as a liaison between Luciano and the outside world, ensuring that Luciano's orders were carried out. Frank Costello's loyalty was invaluable, as he was instrumental in keeping the empire's business afloat while also ensuring Luciano's status remained unchallenged. Similarly, Meyer Lansky, another of Luciano's most trusted lieutenants, kept the financial operations of the mafia running smoothly. Lansky, a brilliant businessman, was well known for his ability to launder money and invest it in legitimate enterprises. With Lansky's help, Luciano's wealth continued to grow, ensuring that the mafia was financially stable and capable of weathering any potential threats, both internal and external. Lansky's ability to reinvest the mafia's earnings into legitimate businesses helped ensure that Luciano's legacy would outlive his prison sentence. The political and legal maneuvering. Though incarcerated, Luciano never stopped playing the political game that had been so vital to his rise. While in prison, Luciano began to cultivate relationships with politicians, both in New York and on the national stage. In particular, his ties to the political establishment were crucial in helping him secure eventual release from prison. Luciano had always understood the importance of corrupting or influencing key figures in power, and his time in prison was no different. Through his contacts, he managed to exert pressure on officials, especially during World War II when his influence proved valuable to the U.S. government. During the war, Luciano's underworld connections, particularly in the shipping industry, were seen as invaluable to the American war effort. The government, desperate for intelligence on enemy ships and shipping lanes, turned to Luciano's men, who had the necessary networks to gather information. Luciano himself offered his cooperation, recognizing the opportunity to use his position for leverage. This cooperation played a crucial role in Luciano's eventual release. In exchange for his cooperation with the government, Luciano's sentence was commuted, and in 1946 he was deported to Italy. Though this did not mark his full freedom, it was a testament to Luciano's political acumen and his ability to manipulate those in power to his advantage. Maintaining control. Luciano's ongoing influence. Even from prison, Luciano's influence continued to shape the mafia. His strategy of having loyalists handle the day-to-day operations allowed him to maintain control over his criminal empire while simultaneously keeping himself insulated from law enforcement. The mafia continued to expand its operations, particularly in Las Vegas, where Bugsy Siegel's efforts to build a gambling empire tied into Luciano's broader vision of a more business-oriented mafia. Luciano's ability to maintain control from within prison, continuing to influence events and shape the direction of his criminal empire, demonstrated the incredible organizational strength he had built. He understood the power of delegation, the value of having trusted men on the outside, and how to play the system in his favor. These skills allowed him to overcome what could have been a fatal setback: his prison sentence. Conclusion: the resilience of Luciano's empire. Luciano's time in prison was far from a mere waiting game. It was a period of strategic management and continued power consolidation. While physically confined, he proved that it wasn't just about brute force and violence in the mafia world. Intelligence, loyalty, and political influence were just as critical to success. His power behind bars wasn't just about maintaining control over an organization, it was about ensuring his legacy. Luciano's ability to navigate his life in prison and continue to influence the mafia demonstrates his true genius as a crime boss. Even when the law seemed to have him cornered, he was able to survive and thrive, manipulating the system, maintaining alliances, and ensuring that his criminal empire remained a force to be reckoned with. This period of his life highlighted the extent to which Luciano's influence transcended the traditional power structures of the mafia and demonstrated his uncanny ability to adapt to any situation, always keeping one step ahead of his adversaries. His time behind bars may have marked the beginning of his exile from America, but it was also a time when his legacy solidified. The mafia's golden age continued, in no small part due to Luciano's continued control, even from the confines of a prison cell. In 1946, after serving a significant portion of his sentence, Lucky Luciano was granted a commutation by the U.S. government, largely due to his assistance during World War II. He was deported to Italy, a place where he had once laid the groundwork for much of his global network but where he had little in terms of personal power anymore. His exile marked the end of his direct control over the mafia's activities in the United States, but it was not the end of his influence. In fact, Luciano's life in exile became another chapter in his remarkable legacy, one that would demonstrate both the resilience of his criminal empire and the evolution of his own character as a man caught between the world of crime and a new reality shaped by his forced separation from his former empire. Adjusting to a new life in Italy. Luciano's return to Italy in 1946 was not the peaceful retreat he may have hoped for. While the Italian government allowed him to live in the country, he was far from a free man. The American authorities had exiled him because of his continued influence on global organized crime, and the Italian authorities, while they did not imprison him, kept a watchful eye on him. He was in a foreign land where his old mafia connections were still growing in strength, but his position in that world had shifted significantly. At first, Luciano struggled with the reality of his exile. In Italy, his influence was far less potent than it had been in America, where he had orchestrated the rise of the mafia through cunning alliances and sheer organizational genius. He was now a symbol of the old world, not the dominant figure who ran the mafia's activities from the shadows. In Italy, Luciano had no criminal infrastructure to command directly. However, he remained a legend, a figurehead for the international mafia and a link to the golden age of organized crime that had grown exponentially in the United States. In Italy, Luciano was somewhat cut off from the day-to-day operations of the mafia that he had meticulously built. The families in New York had continued to grow, with new leaders emerging to take his place, like Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino. Yet, Luciano was never completely powerless. Despite being physically removed from the action, Luciano continued to communicate with his former allies, particularly Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, who were still involved in American operations. Through intermediaries and messages passed between Europe and the United States, Luciano was still involved in strategic decision-making and could influence key mafia decisions. The shift in Luciano's perspective living in Italy, separated from the world he once ruled, caused a subtle but significant shift in Luciano's perspective. Forced to come to terms with his new reality, Luciano began to reflect on his life and the choices that had brought him to this point. He was no longer the invincible figure who could manipulate the system at will, but an exiled criminal, removed from the very empire he had worked so hard to build. The change in environment forced him to consider his own legacy, as well as the personal costs of a life spent in the pursuit of power and dominance. Perhaps most notably, Luciano began to show signs of a personal transformation. In his later years, he developed a sense of remorse and reflection that was absent during his prime. He had always been a man of ruthless ambition, but the years spent in exile allowed him to gain a different perspective on the power he had once wielded. He had become a symbol of the mafia's golden age, but he now appeared as an elder statesman, reflecting on both the heights and the depths of his empire. While Luciano never fully renounced his criminal activities, his perspective on life began to shift. His legacy, once defined by his ability to control and dominate the mafia, began to be colored by the recognition that even the greatest criminals could be brought low by time, fate, and the system. The personal cost of his criminal lifestyle, losing his power, his empire, and his freedom, began to weigh on him. But it was not just the loss of material wealth and influence that haunted him. The toll on his personal life, the fractured relationships with family, friends, and former allies, became more apparent. This was a different Luciano, a man who had lived through the rise, the fall, and the exile, now forced to confront his mortality and the realities of the criminal life that had ultimately stripped him of his power. The final years. An international player in a changing world. Despite the growing reflection on his past, Luciano remained active in the criminal world during his exile. His connections to various mafia families and criminal syndicates around the world allowed him to maintain a level of influence in international operations. His relationship with Meyer Lansky and others ensured that Luciano still had a say in global criminal matters, particularly with regard to gambling, smuggling, and drug trafficking. Luciano's role in facilitating the global expansion of the mafia's influence, particularly through the establishment of operations in Cuba, Italy, and South America, continued to shape organized crime well into his exile. Moreover, Luciano was still involved in some of the illicit dealings that had made him a legend. He remained a key figure in international narcotics operations and smuggling rings, using his relationships with key players in the European and Latin American criminal world to broker deals and expand the mafia's reach. Even as Luciano aged and faced mounting health problems, his international reach remained intact, though now more as a respected figurehead than a hands-on leader. His influence, however, was not just limited to criminal operations. Luciano had a significant impact on the global perception of the mafia, serving as both a symbol of its power and its eventual decline. His persona, and the stories surrounding his rise to power and his eventual fall, became the stuff of legend, contributing to the mythos of the mafia in popular culture. Luciano's final days and death. Luciano's exile lasted for several years, and while he had regained some of his power through international connections, the toll of his past choices began to manifest in his later years. As he grew older, his health deteriorated. Luciano died in 1962 from a heart attack at the age of 64. His death marked the end of an era in the mafia world, a closing chapter on the age of the old-school mob boss. While Luciano was not able to return to America before his death, his legacy continued to shape the world of organized crime long after his passing. His innovations in organizing crime, his ability to forge alliances, and his transition of the mafia from a loosely affiliated network of criminals into a cohesive, business-like organization remain key aspects of his enduring influence. Reflection on Luciano's endgame. The end of Lucky Luciano's life in exile was a fitting conclusion to the rise and fall of one of the most influential figures in criminal history. His exile, while a significant blow to his power, ultimately proved to be a time of reflection and continued influence. Luciano may have lost his physical empire, but he never truly relinquished his status as the ultimate architect of the American mafia. His international legacy, shaped by his time in exile, helped cement his place as a true legend of organized crime, even as the world of the mafia continued to evolve without him at its helm. The legacy of Lucky Luciano is a complex, multifaceted one. His story is far from a simple tale of crime, power, and downfall. It is a narrative filled with lessons on human ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the inherent fragility of power. As one of the most influential figures in the history of organized crime, Luciano's impact on the mafia, the American underworld, and global criminal enterprises is immeasurable. Even decades after his death, his name still resonates in popular culture, academia, and in the stories told by those who still revere him as a godfather of crime. The architect of modern organized crime. Luciano's most enduring legacy lies in the way he transformed the mafia from a chaotic, fragmented network of criminal families into a well-organized, business-like enterprise. Before Luciano, the mafia was often characterized by constant infighting and fragmented authority. With figures like Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano ruling over their respective territories, The mafia structure was more about personal control and raw power than strategic unity. However, Luciano revolutionized this model by instituting a corporate-like structure where power was distributed among a group of influential figures, thus reducing the risk of violent conflicts and increasing the mafia's ability to operate smoothly and profitably. One of Luciano's greatest innovations was the establishment of the Commission, a governing body made up of the heads of the most powerful mafia families, designed to arbitrate disputes and set collective policies. This was a radical departure from the individualistic approach that had previously dominated mafia operations. By creating this system, Luciano not only brought a sense of order to the mafia but also ensured that it could evolve into a much more formidable force, one that was better equipped to handle the pressures of a growing, increasingly complex criminal enterprise. Luciano's organizational model became the blueprint for how the mafia would operate for decades after his reign. Even after his imprisonment and exile, the structure he created endured, guiding the mafia through its most prosperous years. His strategic foresight in this regard elevated the mafia from a disjointed criminal organization to a business empire with international reach and vast economic influence. Influence on the global mafia. Luciano's influence extended far beyond the shores of America. His international connections and operations were crucial in shaping the global landscape of organized crime. His dealings in places like Cuba, Italy, and South America played a pivotal role in expanding the mafia's reach. Luciano's ability to forge relationships with international criminal syndicates, corrupt government officials, and businessmen alike allowed him to establish lucrative criminal enterprises in various countries, turning the mafia into a truly transnational organization. In Cuba, for example, Luciano played a key role in the development of the Havana casino scene, working alongside other mafia bosses to establish a massive gambling operation that generated enormous profits. The relationship between Luciano and Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista is often cited as an example of the way the mafia intertwined itself with legitimate businesses and government institutions, cementing its dominance in multiple industries. In Italy, Luciano's influence was felt even after his deportation, as his connections to Sicilian mafia families remained intact. He played a critical role in the post-war reconstruction of the Italian underworld, maintaining a network of loyalists who helped him influence the direction of mafia operations across the globe. Luciano's international connections and ability to manipulate political and economic systems became a template for future generations of crime bosses who would rely on similar strategies to expand their empires. Legacy in popular culture. Beyond the world of organized crime, Luciano's legacy lives on in popular culture. His life story has been immortalized in films, books, and documentaries, with many seeing him as a figure that embodies the paradoxes of the mafia. He was a man of great intelligence and strategic vision, yet his life was rooted in violence and ruthlessness. His rise to power, marked by the brutal killings of Masuria and Maranzano, is often depicted as a moment of intense drama, while his eventual fall reflects the transient nature of power in the criminal world. Luciano's character has often been portrayed in movies and TV shows as the archetypal godfather, a criminal mastermind who is both a villain and a tragic figure. His portrayal in the Godfather saga, although fictionalized, draws heavily from his own real-life story, blending his qualities as a strategic leader and cold-hearted criminal with the emotional complexity of a man who must come to terms with his own mortality. These portrayals have helped cement Luciano's place in the pantheon of mafia icons and contributed to the enduring fascination with his life and legacy. Luciano's story has also been the subject of academic studies, where scholars have examined his life through the lens of criminology, sociology, and political science. His ability to navigate complex systems of power, manipulate legal structures, and form enduring alliances continues to be studied as an example of leadership, strategy, and survival in a lawless world. His legacy is not simply that of a criminal, it is the legacy of a man who understood the forces that shaped the underworld and used those forces to his advantage. A legacy of power, loyalty, and betrayal. Luciano's life was marked by a series of contrasts. His rise was built on loyalty and camaraderie, but betrayal was never far behind. His relationship with his allies, particularly figures like Frank Costello and Meyer Lansky, was instrumental in his success. Yet, the same ambition that made Luciano such an effective leader also led to betrayals, both from within his organization and from former allies. Vito Genovese's power grab while Luciano was imprisoned is perhaps the most significant example of the personal betrayal that punctuated Luciano's life. However, even the betrayals that could have shattered lesser men, only added to the complexity of Luciano's legacy. His ability to survive these personal and professional setbacks, maintaining his power and influence in the face of them, speaks to the iron will that defined him. The cycle of loyalty, betrayal, and survival was not just a feature of Luciano's life, it was the very essence of the mafia world that he helped create. Reflection. A mythical figure today, Lucky Luciano is a legendary figure, his name synonymous with the mafia and the golden age of organized crime. His life story continues to be a source of intrigue, inspiration, and cautionary tales about the nature of power and the cost of ambition. He rose from the streets of New York to become one of the most feared and respected men in the world, but his ultimate fall, marked by betrayal, legal entanglements, and exile, serves as a poignant reminder of the fragility of criminal empires and the fleeting nature of power. Luciano's legacy, however, endures. He built the foundation upon which the modern mafia was built, and even in his absence, his fingerprints remain all over the criminal world. His story is one of brilliance, ruthlessness, and survival, qualities that continue to define the allure of the mafia. Through his empire, his personal journey, and his undeniable influence, Luciano's name remains synonymous with the mafia itself, immortalized in both the real world and the world of fiction, ensuring that his legacy will never be forgotten. The story of Lucky Luciano is not just the tale of one man's rise and fall, it is a saga that reflects the broader dynamics of power, ambition, and survival within the underworld. From a poor, street-smart immigrant to the mastermind behind the most influential organized crime empire in American history, Luciano's life is a testament to the complexities of criminal enterprise and the intricacies of human nature. His impact on the mafia and the world of organized crime remains profound, and his story continues to captivate those who seek to understand the psychology of power, betrayal, and legacy. The complexity of Luciano's character. Luciano was a man of many contradictions. On the one hand, he was a ruthless criminal who built his empire on violence, deceit, and manipulation. On the other hand, he displayed qualities of a visionary, a leader who saw the mafia not as a loose collection of thugs but as a sophisticated, business-oriented organization. His ability to blend these two aspects, brutality and brilliance, was what made him such a formidable figure. He understood the importance of loyalty, but he also knew when to be cold and calculating, always with an eye on the bigger picture. His ability to forge alliances with a range of people, ranging from politicians to businessmen, and even international criminals, demonstrated a level of strategic thinking that set him apart from other crime bosses. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Luciano understood that power was not just about control over territory but about creating systems that could function independently of him. The mafia he built was a machine that continued to operate efficiently even after his imprisonment and exile. His legacy, in many ways, was his ability to organize chaos and turn it into something lasting. Yet, as his life demonstrates, the pursuit of power, no matter how brilliantly executed, always carries a cost. The price of power and the cost of ambition. At the heart of Luciano's story is the theme of ambition. Ambition that led him to the pinnacle of power but also led to his downfall. Luciano's ambition was not only to control the mafia but to reshape it into an entity that could function like a legitimate business. His vision was far-reaching. He wanted to create an organization that could endure, not just thrive for a few years but continue to operate long after his reign. However, this ambition was also what made him a target. As he climbed higher, he attracted not only allies but also enemies, some of whom would betray him in the end. Luciano's ability to inspire loyalty was integral to his rise, but in the mafia world, loyalty is often fragile. His betrayal by figures like Vito Genovese and the eventual legal downfall illustrate the precarious nature of trust in such an environment. Even the most strategic leaders cannot entirely avoid betrayal, especially when their empire becomes too large to control from the inside. It is a cruel irony that Luciano's greatest strength, his ambition, was also his greatest weakness. His drive for power led him to create something that outgrew him, and when he was no longer able to control it, the system began to fracture. His downfall wasn't just a result of external forces, but the inevitable consequence of an empire built on ambition and conflict. The end of an era. Luciano's death in 1962 marked the end of an era in the mafia. By the time of his passing, the underworld he had built was already undergoing profound changes. New leaders, new power structures, and new methods of operation had emerged. His departure symbolized the end of the golden age of the mafia, a time when the underworld was dominated by larger-than-life figures like him. But Luciano's influence did not disappear with his death. The systems he put in place, the alliances he forged, and the innovations he introduced continued to shape the mafia for years to come. His legacy lived on through his loyalists, figures like Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, and Carlo Gambino, who carried his vision forward and adapted it to a changing world. In many ways, Luciano's true legacy was the enduring structure he built, which outlasted both his lifetime and his physical presence in the mafia. He transformed the criminal enterprise from a ragtag group of rogue gangs into an international syndicate that operated like a multinational corporation, with a clear division of labor and a global reach. Luciano's mythical status and the continuing fascination despite his criminal activity and the violent nature of his rise to power, Luciano's story continues to fascinate the public. He has become a mythical figure in the history of organized crime, a man whose influence extended beyond the world of crime and into the realm of legend. His life is one of paradoxes, ruthless yet visionary, brutal yet strategic. It is this complexity that makes his story so captivating and ensures his place in the pantheon of infamous historical figures. Luciano's life has been endlessly romanticized in films, books, and documentaries. The portrayal of him as the cool, calculating, and charismatic boss has contributed to his enduring popularity in popular culture. Yet, the reality of his life was far from glamorous. His story is one of constant struggle, both internally and externally, as he navigated the cutthroat world of organized crime. But it is precisely this struggle that gives his life meaning and makes his legacy so compelling. The human condition, power, morality, and redemption at its core, Luciano's story is a reflection on the human condition. It is about the pursuit of power and the toll it takes on the individual. While Luciano's criminal enterprises were built on immorality and violence, the personal struggles he faced, his betrayals, his imprisonment, and his ultimate exile, offer a deeper look into the costs of such a life. Despite his criminality, Luciano's story is not devoid of humanity. His reflections during his years of exile, his contemplation of the costs of power, and his ultimate understanding of his own mortality show a man who was not entirely consumed by the world he helped create. Luciano's death marked the conclusion of a life of contrasts. He was a man who built an empire based on violence and ruthlessness, yet his story continues to evoke sympathy and fascination. In his final years, he came to terms with the fact that no amount of power or wealth could change the course of his life. His legacy, then, is not only about the mafia he built but also about the universal themes of ambition, loyalty, betrayal, and the fleeting nature of power. The enduring legacy in the end, Luciano's legacy is both a warning and an enduring symbol of power's complexity. He is remembered not just as a criminal mastermind, but as a figure who reshaped the criminal world and whose influence extends far beyond the world of organized crime. The mafia Luciano built would live on long after him, and so too would the lessons his life offers. His rise to power, his brilliance in organizing crime, and his ultimate fall remind us that in the pursuit of greatness, there is always a price. But Luciano's ability to adapt, survive, and leave an indelible mark on history guarantees that his story will continue to resonate for generations to come. Luciano's myth may have been built on crime, but his legacy is one that transcends the world of organized crime, touching on themes of human nature, ambition, and the cost of living by the sword. The story of Lucky Luciano is far from over. It remains a reflection on power, morality, and the legacy we leave behind.